When Tom came looking for a wife, Lord Abernathy polished his two brightest daughters like prized fillies at a country auction. He paraded their wit, their immaculate posture, and their impeccable breeding. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy this peaceful space, please like and subscribe to support us. Now, let's return to our story. Nobody looked at the youngest girl standing quietly in the corner, pouring the Darjeeling tea. But a man drowning in noise doesn't want a songbird. He wants peace. The rain had been falling for 3 days, turning the carriage drives of Hampshire into thick, sucking bogs. Lord Richard Abernathy did not care. He stood beside the tall, draughty windows of the morning room, his breath fogging the glass, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had turned white. "He's coming," Richard said. The words dropped like stones into the quiet room. Behind him, the Abernathy sisters arranged themselves. It was an exercise in calculated composure. Charlotte, the eldest by 3 years, sat nearest the hearth. The firelight caught the golden threads woven through her dark hair. She held a piece of needlepoint she hadn't actually worked on in a month. It was simply a prop. Charlotte understood the mechanics of this afternoon better than anyone. At 24, she was staring down the barrel of spinsterhood. But she was beautiful, sharp, striking, and ambitious enough to frighten anyone. "Is his carriage crest visible?" Charlotte asked. She didn't look up. Her voice remained perfectly level. "Mud," Richard snapped. "Covered in mud. But it is a crest. 6 horses. Only a duke drives 6 through this slop." On the velvet settee, Rosalind turned another page of her book, French Poetry by Rousseau. She didn't speak French particularly well, but the volume looked impressive resting in her lap. Rosalind was the middle child. If Charlotte was the beauty, Rosalind was the wit. She could quote parliamentary debates and play the pianoforte with precise, almost mathematical perfection. "Do calm down, father," Rosalind murmured, moistening her thumb before turning another page. "If you sweat through your collar before His Grace even crosses the threshold, he'll think we're desperate." "We are desperate," Richard growled, turning from the window. "The roof over the west wing is rotting. The tenants are withholding rent. If one of you doesn't secure a settlement by Michaelmas, we'll be eating the horses." Hazel stood beside the sideboard. She said nothing. She rarely did when the air in the room grew this heavy. Hazel was 20. She possessed neither Charlotte's striking beauty nor Rosalind's brilliant intellect. She was small, pale, and entirely unremarkable. Her dress was a muted gray, not by choice but because the dressmaker's fabric had run out after outfitting her sisters, leaving only the duller cloth for the youngest daughter. She quietly organized the tea service. Heavy silver. Delicate porcelain cups painted with fading blue swallows. She wiped a tiny smudge from a saucer with her thumb. Then the heavy oak front doors groaned open somewhere below. The sound of boots striking polished marble echoed up the staircase. "Positions," Richard hissed. He hurriedly smoothed his thinning hair before marching into the hall to greet what he hoped would be his family's salvation. Hazel stepped back, disappearing into the shadows beside the heavy velvet curtains. She watched her sisters. Charlotte pinched her cheeks until a rosy blush bloomed across her face. Rosalind snapped her book shut, leaving one finger between the pages so she would appear elegantly interrupted. Footsteps approached. Then Tom entered the room. Tom did not look like a man who owned half of Derbyshire. He looked tired. He was 31, tall, broad-shouldered, and completely soaked. Rain had plastered his dark hair against his forehead. His heavy riding coat dripped steadily onto the Abernathy's threadbare Persian rug. He carried no cane. He wore no top hat. Instead, he looked like a man who had ridden the last 5 miles on horseback rather than endure a stuffy carriage. His boots were thick with gray mud. A faint scar tugged at the corner of his left eye, a souvenir from the Peninsular War. He had inherited the dukedom only a year earlier after his elder brother broke his neck in a hunting accident. Tom had never been raised to rule a duchy. He had been raised to be a soldier. Standing in the doorway, his gray eyes swept across the room. It was not the gaze of a man searching for romance. It was the careful assessment of a military officer. "Your Grace," Richard boomed, practically vibrating with nervous excitement. "Welcome to Highfield. May I present my daughters?" Charlotte rose first. The rustle of her silk skirt filled the otherwise silent room. She performed a flawless curtsy, every movement perfectly calculated to display her graceful neck and elegant collarbones. "Your Grace," she said softly, "you must be terribly cold. The roads are dreadful this time of year." "They are mud," Tom replied. His voice was deep and rough. He did not smile. "I apologize for bringing it into your home." "Think nothing of it," Richard laughed, far too loudly. "We are honored, truly honored. And this is my second daughter, Rosalind." Rosalind stood, keeping one finger inside her book. She offered a smaller, more scholarly curtsy. "It is an honor, Your Grace. I was just reading about the agricultural reforms in the northern counties. I understand your estates have recently adopted the new crop rotations. A remarkably bold decision." "Too bold," Hazel thought quietly from the corner. Tom blinked. He looked first at Rosalind, then at the book in her hands. "My stewards manage the crop rotations, Miss Rosalind," he answered calmly. "I mostly concern myself with the ledgers." Her intellectual bait landed with a dull thud. Rosalind's smile flickered for only the briefest moment before settling neatly back into place. "And the youngest," Richard said with a dismissive wave toward the sideboard. "Hazel." Tom looked beyond the glowing fireplace, beyond the dazzling Charlotte, beyond the brilliant Rosalind, into the quiet shadows. Hazel didn't step forward. She didn't perform an elaborate curtsy. She simply inclined her head, her hands still resting gently upon the cool mahogany sideboard. "Your Grace," she said softly. Tom held her gaze for a single moment. Nothing crossed his expression. He nodded once before turning back to Lord Abernathy. "I appreciate your hospitality, Lord Abernathy," Tom said, unbuttoning his heavy, rain-soaked coat. A footman hurried forward to take it. "I shall only stay an hour. I have business in London tomorrow evening." An hour. Panic tightened inside Richard's chest. An hour to sell a daughter. Of course," Richard replied hurriedly. "Please sit by the fire and warm yourself. Girls, entertain His Grace." Tom sank into the wingback chair. It creaked beneath his weight. His joints ached. The dampness of the English countryside always made the shrapnel buried in his thigh throb. He stared into the flames licking the soot-stained bricks of the hearth. He hated this. He hated the season. He hated the ballrooms. And most of all, he hated these private viewings. He knew exactly why he was here. He needed an heir. He needed a wife. The Dowager Duchess, his terrifying mother, had handed him a list of acceptable young women. The Abernathy girls were on it. Good bloodlines. Bankrupt father. It meant they would be eager, compliant, and inexpensive to marry. He wouldn't have to deal with demanding in-laws. He could pay off Lord Abernathy's debts, take a wife back to Derbyshire, shut the doors of his estate, and finally be left alone. "May I offer you some wine, Your Grace?" Charlotte asked. She hovered beside his chair. Her perfume was overwhelming. Lavender mixed with heavy musk. It smelled like a crowded London ballroom. It made his headache worse. "Tea if you have it," Tom said without looking at her. "I have a long ride ahead." "Of course," Charlotte beamed. She snapped her fingers toward her younger sister. "Hazel, tea for His Grace." She didn't even glance at Hazel as she gave the order. It was simply a reflex. Tom noticed. He said nothing, but his eyes followed the sharp, dismissive snap of Charlotte's fingers. "Tell me, Your Grace," Charlotte continued, gracefully lowering herself onto the sofa opposite him and leaning forward just enough to appear charming. "Do you plan to spend the winter in London or at your country estate?" I've always preferred the country. London is so exhausting, Charlotte replied. It was a lie. Tom could smell the lie. Women like Charlotte lived for the London social season. If he shut her away in Derbyshire for an entire winter, she would go mad and take him with her. Derbyshire, he answered flatly. It is quiet. Oh, I adore the quiet, Charlotte said smoothly. Do you? Rosalind interrupted as she walked toward the pianoforte. You complained just yesterday that the lack of callers was driving you to madness, sister. A flash of pure venom crossed Charlotte's face before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Rosalind settled onto the piano bench, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance. Perhaps some music, Your Grace. The weather is so dismal. A little melody might chase the damp away. If you wish, Tom replied. He rubbed 2 fingers against his temple. Rosalind did not choose a gentle parlor tune. Instead, she launched into a complex, frantic sonata. Her fingers pounded across the keys, displaying years of rigorous training, relentless discipline, and absolute mastery of the instrument. It was loud. Inside the warm, humid morning room, every note ricocheted off the plaster walls and hammered into Tom's aching skull. He slowly closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He had spent 4 years listening to cannon fire and the screams of dying men on muddy battlefields. He didn't want dazzling mastery. He wanted silence. Lord Abernathy stood proudly beside the mantel, completely oblivious to the way Tom's knuckles had turned white around the arms of the chair. Splendid, isn't she? Richard shouted over the crashing chords. Taught by a master from Vienna. Tom answered with nothing more than a stiff, mechanical nod. He wanted to leave. His eyes drifted toward the clock resting upon the mantel. 50 minutes remained. He could survive 50 more minutes. Through the deafening barrage of the sonata came the faint clink of porcelain. Tom opened his eyes. Hazel. She stood beside the small table near his chair. He hadn't even heard her approach. She moved with remarkable silence, stepping lightly across the old creaking floorboards. In her hands rested a delicate cup and saucer. Hazel had been watching him ever since he arrived. She noticed the way he favored his left leg. She noticed the dark exhaustion beneath his eyes. She watched Charlotte suffocate him with perfume and empty compliments. She watched Rosalind assault him with Beethoven. He looked like an animal caught in a trap, too polite to chew off his own leg to escape. Hazel understood traps. She had lived inside one her entire life. When your only purpose within a family is to serve as the quiet background against which your sisters shine, you learn to observe. You learn to read every room. She had prepared the tea herself. The silver pot had been heavy, the metal hot against the cotton of her gloves. The Abernethys always served tea drowned in heavy cream and piled high with crystallized sugar, a desperate attempt to appear wealthier than they truly were. But one look at the hard, weathered lines on Tom's face told Hazel something different. A man who rides through storms. A man who stares into a fire with weary resentment. Doesn't want sweet things. She poured the tea dark, rich, strong. No milk, no sugar. While Rosalind struck another particularly violent chord, Hazel quietly carried the cup across the room. She didn't interrupt. She didn't smile. She didn't ask whether he preferred it weak or strong. She didn't even ask for his attention. She simply lowered the cup and saucer onto the small wooden table beside his right elbow. The porcelain touched the wood with the softest clink. Tom looked down at the cup. Dark tea. A thin ribbon of steam curled gently into the air. Then he looked up at Hazel. She stood close enough that he caught her scent. Not lavender. Not heavy musk. She smelled of fresh starch, clean cotton, and the faint, comforting scent of rain-soaked earth that it was a grounded scent. A real one. No sugar? Tom asked. His voice was low beneath the relentless music of the piano. Hazel met his gaze. Her eyes were a remarkable shade of pale hazel, balanced somewhere between green and gold. They were, by far, the most striking thing about her. You do not strike me as a man who coats a bitter thing in sugar to pretend it is sweet, your grace, she said quietly. Her voice was calm and steady. There was no flirtation in it, no desperation. It was simply a statement of fact. Tom stared at her. The pounding of the pianoforte seemed to fade into distant white noise. He reached for the cup. As Hazel withdrew her hand, his fingers brushed lightly against hers. Her skin was warm. He lifted the cup to his lips and took a slow drink. The tea was strong and pleasantly astringent. Its warmth spread through him, cutting cleanly through the damp chill that had settled deep into his bones. It is perfect, Tom said softly. Exactly right. Hazel gave the slightest nod. I'm glad. She didn't linger. She didn't seize the opportunity to impress him with stories about herself. She simply turned and returned to the quiet shadows beside the sideboard, leaving him alone with his perfectly brewed tea. Tom watched her walk away. Then he took another slow sip. At the pianoforte, Rosalind struck the final chord, allowing it to ring triumphantly through the room. She turned on the bench, breathing slightly harder than before, a victorious smile fixed upon her face. Beautifully played, Rosalind, Charlotte said, though her voice carried more acid than admiration. She looked toward Tom. Don't you agree, your grace? Tom carefully placed the teacup back onto its saucer. I'm afraid I lack the ear for it, he replied plainly. Rosalind's smile cracked. But surely, Lord Abernathy interrupted, stepping forward in a desperate attempt to regain control of the conversation, you appreciate a woman of accomplishments. A duchess must host, after all. She must entertain. Tom looked at the sweating, anxious father. Then at the two older sisters, leaning forward like hounds waiting for the chase. I have no interest in entertaining, Tom said. The room fell completely silent. Only the rain beating against the windows could be heard. My life in Derbyshire is almost entirely devoid of society. My estate is remote. The house is old and it is draughty. I do not host balls. I do not attend Parliament unless His Majesty practically drags me there. He paused. A woman seeking admiration and constant amusement would perish from boredom within a month. Charlotte's jaw tightened. The thought of spending her life buried in the countryside, far from London's glittering social season, horrified her. But he was still one of the most powerful men in England. She forced a nervous laugh. You exaggerate your isolation, surely. I assure you, Miss Abernathy, I do not. Tom rose to his feet. The hour was not yet over, but he had already seen enough. He had made his decision. Lord Abernathy's face flushed a deep shade of panicked crimson. Your Grace, please. You've only just arrived. I have seen all I need to see, Lord Abernathy. Tom turned slowly toward the room. He did not look at Charlotte. He did not look at Rosalind. Instead, his eyes found the young woman in the simple gray dress standing quietly beside the wall. Miss Hazel. Every head in the room turned. Charlotte spun around. Rosalind rose from the piano bench. Hazel blinked once before stepping slightly out of the shadows. Yes, Your Grace? Do you play the pianoforte? No, Your Grace. I have no ear for music. Do you enjoy London society? I have never been to London. A faint pause. I imagine it is rather loud. Tom's chest rose with what might almost have been a silent laugh. For the first time that afternoon, the tight lines around his eyes softened. It is, he admitted. He took a step toward her. The heavy thud of his boots echoed across the old wooden floor, tightening the tension in the room. And if you found yourself living in an isolated, draughty house in Derbyshire, with no callers, no balls, and no society, how would you spend your days? Lord Abernathy made a strangled sound of protest. Your Grace, Hazel is, she's merely the youngest. She hasn't even made her formal debut. She isn't prepared for. I am speaking to her, Lord Abernathy. Tom's voice cracked through the room with the unmistakable authority of a seasoned military officer. Richard immediately fell silent. Tom stopped only a few feet from Hazel. He looked down at her. Well? Hazel did not flinch beneath his gaze. She met his eyes with calm certainty. She thought about his muddy boots. She remembered how tightly he had gripped the chair while the music thundered around him. She imagined the quiet, windswept house he had described. Then she answered, I would walk the moors. I would read in silence. And I would make certain the tea was always brewed properly. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the Abernathy morning room. Charlotte stared at her younger sister as though she had suddenly become someone else entirely. Rosalind's face had gone pale with disbelief. Tom held Hazel's gaze for a long moment. For that brief instant, the cold calculations of the marriage market simply disappeared. It was no longer a negotiation between families. It was two quiet people recognizing something familiar in one another amid a room full of noise. Lord Abernathy, Tom said without taking his eyes off Hazel. Yes, Your Grace, Richard stammered. I would like to speak with you privately in your study, regarding the marriage settlement. Tom finally looked away from Hazel and turned his broad frame toward the door. I require no further introductions. He paused. I have found my Duchess. The study door closed behind them with a heavy, final thud. Lord Richard Abernathy hurried toward the mahogany desk, his hands trembling as he gestured toward a leather armchair. Please, sit, Your Grace. Tom remained standing beside the cold, unlit hearth. His towering frame seemed to dwarf the room. Brandy, Your Grace? Richard offered, his voice pitched a little too high. Ink, Tom replied. And paper. Richard swallowed the rest of his carefully rehearsed hospitality. He quickly removed a fresh sheet of parchment from a drawer and placed a brass inkwell beside it. Then he waited, like a man expecting either a shower of gold or the fall of a guillotine. He wasn't certain which. Tom stepped to the desk. He had never been a man for unnecessary pleasantries. He was a soldier. He dealt in facts, in numbers, in logistics. I will clear every debt tied to this estate, Tom said evenly. Your creditors in London will be paid by Friday. I will also establish an allowance of £800 a year for the maintenance of Highfield, paid quarterly. Richard's eyes widened. £800. It was more money than he had ever dared hope for. It was salvation. His mouth opened to pour out endless gratitude. Tom lifted one scarred hand. There are conditions. The words froze Richard in place. Tom leaned both hands against the desk, bringing his face closer. His gray eyes held no warmth whatsoever. First, you will use part of that allowance to repair the roof over the west wing. If I learn that your tenants are still living beneath damp, rotting timber by next winter, the allowance ends immediately. Yes, absolutely, Your Grace. The roof, of course. Second, my marriage to your daughter will take place tomorrow morning. A special license. No bands. No guests. No wedding breakfast. We leave for Derbyshire by noon. Tomorrow? Richard blurted. For one brief moment, panic overcame greed. But, her trousseau. The modiste requires weeks. A duke's bride cannot possibly go to the altar dressed in rags. She will go to the altar wearing whatever she has on, Tom answered. I am not purchasing a dress. He held Richard's gaze. I am choosing a wife. Silence. And my final condition. Tom straightened. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. You and your elder daughters will never set foot in Derbyshire. The allowance is your pension. Consider it the price of my privacy. If you attempt to visit, or if you write asking for additional money, our arrangement is void. Richard blinked. For a brief instant, wounded pride battled financial desperation. Desperation won. Easily. He nodded so vigorously that his jowls trembled. Agreed, Your Grace. Entirely agreed. Draft the terms, Tom said, gesturing toward the parchment. My solicitor will finalize the contract this evening. Upstairs, silence filled the sisters' bedchamber. Not peaceful silence, venomous silence. Hazel knelt upon the uneven floorboards, carefully folding a faded wool shawl into a battered leather trunk. It was one of the very few possessions she owned that had never belonged to Charlotte or Rosalind. Charlotte paced furiously from one end of the room to the other. Her silk slippers struck sharply against the wooden floor. Her face had turned pale. The rosy marks she had pinched into her cheeks earlier had faded into an unhealthy white. "It is a punishment," Charlotte said. Her voice trembled with barely controlled rage. "He's mocking us. A man like that. A duke. Choosing the scullery maid." "I am not a scullery maid, Charlotte," Hazel replied quietly. She folded another pair of thick wool stockings into the trunk. "You might as well be." Charlotte spun toward her, pointing a trembling finger. "Look at you. You have no grace, no charm, no conversation. You poured him tea. That is all you did. He chose you because you are nothing. A blank wall. Someone he will never have to truly notice." Hazel did not look up. Her hands continued smoothing the rough wool of the stockings. She understood that Charlotte's words were born from humiliation. A wounded pride lashes out at whatever stands closest. But Hazel also knew something else. Charlotte was not entirely wrong. "I know," Hazel answered softly. The simple agreement stopped Charlotte in mid-sentence. She stared at her younger sister, breathing heavily. "You know, he doesn't want a wife to love," Hazel said at last, lifting her eyes. Their pale green and gold color reflected the weak gray light filtering through the rain-streaked window. "He wants peace. And I think that is all I have ever really known. He wants a ghost to haunt his house." Hazel closed the last clasp on her trunk. "He chose me because I am already invisible." She looked calmly at her sisters. "It is a terrible insult to both of you, but it is also the truth." Rosalind, who had been sitting silently on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall, let out a short, bitter laugh. "A ghost?" She shook her head. "You're going to be buried alive in the north, Hazel. The man is a brute. Did you see his hands? They look like the hands of someone who digs his own ditches." "He looks tired," Hazel corrected gently. "He will crush you," Charlotte sneered, though much of the fury had already drained from her voice. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, suddenly looking much colder than before. "You'll be a duchess in name only, living inside a tomb. You'll have nothing." Hazel lowered her eyes to the battered trunk. She thought about the suffocating noise of Highfield, the endless fear of debt, the constant competition, the desperate hunger for attention that ruled every room of the house. She closed the lid of the trunk. The brass buckles snapped shut with a sharp click. "I will have quiet," Hazel said simply. They were married at 10 o'clock the following morning in the village chapel. The priest smelled faintly of stale gin and hurried through the wedding service as though he had another appointment waiting. Hazel wore her best Sunday dress. It was made of dark navy wool, far too heavy for the humid summer morning. Tom wore a plain black coat. He never smiled. When he slipped the heavy gold wedding band onto Hazel's finger, his touch was brief and almost clinical. His hand was warm. The calluses on his fingers were rough against her smooth skin. By noon, they were already inside the carriage. It was a massive traveling coach suspended on heavy leather straps and pulled by 6 powerful gray horses. The interior was lined with dark green velvet that carried the scent of beeswax and old dust. Hazel sat on the forward-facing bench. Tom sat opposite her. The carriage lurched forward, rolling through the crumbling gates of Highfield for the final time. Hazel never looked back. Instead, her eyes remained fixed upon the polished silver handle of the carriage door. Neither of them spoke during the first 30 minutes of the journey. The rain had finally stopped, but the roads remained deep rivers of mud, carved into dangerous ruts by days of relentless storms. The The carriage rocked violently from side to side. Every jolt sent another sharp shock through Hazel's spine. She gripped the velvet seat to steady herself, refusing to brace herself against the carriage walls. Tom watched her quietly. His arms were folded across his broad chest. His long legs occupied most of the floor space. His injured left leg remained stretched stiffly before him. He observed his new wife with the same calm, detached attention he might have given a line of newly enlisted soldiers. She was remarkably still. Most women he had known, his mother, his late brother's companions, would have filled the silence with endless conversation. They would have complained about every bump in the road. They would have asked how much farther remained. They would have demanded frequent stops for tea. Hazel did none of those things. She sat perfectly upright, accepting every violent jolt without a single complaint. "You may lean back, madam," Tom said at last. His deep voice startled her. It was the first time he had spoken since they had stood together before the altar. "The upholstery is not made of glass." Hazel blinked and slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. "I'm quite all right, Your Grace." Tom looked at her for a moment before replying. "We have 3 days of travel ahead of us. If you sit like a ramrod for the entire journey, your spine will snap before we reach the Trent." Hazel slowly relaxed her shoulders. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean back against the deep velvet upholstery. It was remarkably comfortable. She let out a small, quiet breath. "Thank you," she said. The silence returned, but its sharpest edge had softened. By nightfall, the weather turned foul once again. A biting wind swept across the Midlands, hurling rain against the carriage windows like handfuls of gravel. They stopped at a coaching inn near Oxford. It was not the sort of establishment a duke would normally visit. The yard echoed with shouting hostlers, stamping horses, and the heavy smell of wet leather, mud, and manure. Tom stepped down from the carriage first. He did not simply offer Hazel a hand. Instead, he held out his entire forearm, steady and rigid, allowing her to step safely onto the muddy mounting block. The inn's private parlor had already been claimed by a traveling merchant. The innkeeper, a sweating man in a stained apron, took one look at Tom's cold expression, and the heavy purse in his hand, and miraculously discovered a small, drafty room beside the kitchen. Dinner was served on a scarred wooden table. Tough mutton, boiled potatoes that tasted faintly of dirt, and a jug of weak, sour ale. Tom cut into the gray meat without hesitation. He had eaten worse. The army had seen to that for years. He expected his new duchess, raised in a household clinging to aristocratic pretensions, to push the plate away in disgust. He waited for complaints. He waited for tears. He waited for the inevitable collapse. None came. Hazel calmly picked up her knife and fork. She cut a small piece of mutton, chewed it carefully, swallowed, then took a sip of the ale. She didn't grimace. She simply cut another bite. Tom paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Is it to your liking?" he asked, a hint of dry amusement creeping into his voice. "It is entirely adequate," Hazel replied without looking up. "It is boot leather, madam." Hazel set down her fork. Across the wavering light of the tallow candle, she met his eyes. "I have eaten worse, Your Grace. When Father's gambling debts became particularly severe last winter, the butcher stopped delivering meat. We lived on potato soup for 3 weeks." She picked up her fork again. "This is perfectly acceptable." Tom stared at her. Her blunt honesty caught him completely off guard. There was no shame, no self-pity, no attempt to earn sympathy. Only the quiet statement of a simple fact. He slowly lowered his own fork. "I see. Please don't concern yourself with my comfort, Your Grace," Hazel continued. "I require very little. You will find that I am a very inexpensive investment." The words were spoken gently, but they struck Tom like a physical blow. A very inexpensive investment. That was exactly how he had viewed the marriage. Exactly how he had calculated it. Yet hearing Hazel describe herself that way, with no resentment whatsoever, tightened an uncomfortable knot deep inside his chest. "Eat your dinner, Hazel," Tom said gruffly. It was the first time he had spoken her name. They finished the meal in silence. This time, the silence no longer felt cold. On the third afternoon, the Peak District rose before them. A harsh landscape of jagged stone, steep valleys, and endless shadow. The gentle green hills of southern England disappeared behind them, replaced by wild heather and relentless winds. Hazel pressed her face lightly against the cool carriage window. She had never seen mountains before. The sheer scale of the land stole her breath. It was beautiful, but it was a lonely, unforgiving kind of beauty. "It is bleak," Tom observed, watching her expression. "It is immense," Hazel whispered. The carriage turned off the main road. Two weather-beaten stone pillars crowned with carved griffins marked the entrance. Their rusted iron gates stood permanently open. For another 2 miles the carriage rolled through a dense, untamed forest. Then the trees suddenly parted. The estate appeared. Stoneleigh Hall. It was not a welcoming house. It was an enormous fortress of gray stone, built in a square defensive design as though it expected to withstand a siege. Its windows were narrow and tall, reflecting the gray sky like blind eyes. There were no carefully tended gardens, no flowering borders, no elegant lawns. The wild moorland crept almost to the edge of the gravel drive. The carriage finally came to a halt before massive oak doors. There was no grand welcoming party. Only a single footman hurried down the stone steps to open the carriage door. Tom climbed out first. This time he turned immediately to help Hazel descend. She stepped onto the gravel. The wind instantly caught her cloak, whipping loose strands of hair across her face. She looked up at the towering facade. It looked less like a home, and more like either a fortress or a prison. "Welcome to Derbyshire," Tom said quietly. Together they climbed the broad stone steps. The great oak doors swung open. The entrance hall beyond was vast. The floor was laid with black and white marble, dulled by years without proper polishing. Far overhead hung a massive iron chandelier suspended from a vaulted ceiling. Inside, the air felt even colder than outside. The hall smelled of wood ash, old paper, and damp stone. Waiting at the foot of the sweeping staircase stood a woman dressed in severe black bombazine. She was tall, gaunt. A heavy ring of iron keys hung from her waist. "Mrs. Gable," Tom said, removing his leather riding gloves. "This is my wife, the new Duchess of Aldrich." Mrs. Gable did not smile. She offered only a stiff, perfectly measured curtsy. Her pale, hawk-like eyes swept over Hazel's travel-stained navy dress and simple wool cloak. It was immediately obvious that the housekeeper found the new Duchess disappointing. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice echoed through the empty stone hall. "We were not expecting your arrival quite so soon. The master suite has not yet been prepared for a bride." "Prepare the East Wing suite for her Grace," Tom ordered, tossing his gloves onto a silver tray resting on a nearby table. "I shall remain in my present quarters." Hazel felt a small, sharp ache inside her chest. Not sorrow. Only the final, undeniable confirmation of what this marriage truly was. They would live in separate wings of an enormous, almost empty, stone house. "As you wish," Mrs. Gable replied smoothly. Not a trace of surprise crossed her face. "Shall I arrange for tea in the drawing room?" Mrs. Gable asked. "No. I have letters to write." "Send a tray to my study." Tom turned toward Hazel. In the dim entrance hall, he looked even larger, his broad shoulders blocking the weak afternoon light spilling through the open doors. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms," he said. "The house is yours to command. If you require anything, speak to her. We dine at 8. Do not be late." He did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked away. His boots echoed sharply across the marble floor. His injured left leg dragged ever so slightly with fatigue. Moments later, he disappeared into the darkness of an arched corridor. Hazel remained standing in the freezing entrance hall, alone, with a housekeeper who regarded her much like a stain upon an expensive carpet. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, turning toward the staircase. They climbed 3 long flights of stairs. Then another corridor. It seemed to stretch for an eternity. Most of the doors they passed remained tightly shut. The rooms beyond them lay silent, and used, almost forgotten. The stillness inside the house was absolute. It pressed against the ears until silence itself seemed to make a sound. Finally, Mrs. Gable unlocked a heavy oak door and pushed it open. The East Wing suite. Hazel stepped inside. The room was enormous. Dark oak paneling lined every wall. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its faded crimson velvet curtains hanging heavily around it. Near the tall windows stood a small sitting area. A vanity table. An empty fireplace. Dust motes drifted lazily through the pale afternoon light. The room was bitterly cold. "I shall send a maid to light the fire," Mrs. Gable said, lingering in the doorway, "and to unpack your belongings." "That won't be necessary," Hazel replied. Mrs. Gable frowned. "Not necessary, Your Grace? A duchess does not unpack her own luggage. I prefer to do it myself." Hazel's voice remained calm. Even she understood exactly what this conversation truly was. The servants were testing her. They expected a frightened young bride, one who had been handed over to a monster. "As you wish," Mrs. Gable replied. Her tone suggested she considered the new duchess rather foolish. "Will there be anything else?" "Yes." Hazel walked toward the tall windows. Beyond the glass stretched miles of rolling, dark heather fading into the distant horizon. "Please send up a pot of loose-leaf tea. Boiling water. Separate. And no sugar." Mrs. Gable blinked. "No sugar, Your Grace?" "None." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You are dismissed." The housekeeper stiffened. She gave a brief, reluctant nod before quietly closing the door behind her. Hazel was alone. She stood in the center of the enormous, freezing room and listened. No carriage wheels rattling over cobblestones. No shrill laughter from Charlotte. No furious piano playing from Rosalind. No anxious pacing from her father. Only the wind, howling softly against the thick window panes. Hazel slowly unclasped her heavy traveling cloak and let it slip gently to the floor. She crossed to the great 4-poster bed. Her fingers traced the carved wooden post. Solid. Real. Then she walked to the window once more. Outside stretched the lonely beauty of the endless moors. Charlotte had called this place a tomb. Rosalind had insisted she would be buried alive here. Hazel rested her forehead against the cool glass. Small, completely genuine. Smile appeared. She had a room of her own. She had silence. She had more space than she had ever imagined possible. And she had a husband who demanded absolutely nothing from her, except her absence. For the first time in 20 years, Hazel felt she could finally breathe. The first month at Stoneleigh Hall settled into a quiet rhythm. A rhythm built almost entirely on absence. Tom left the house before dawn each morning. He rode the boundaries of the estate, met with tenant farmers, inspected collapsing stone walls, worked until the old wound in his thigh burned with phantom pain. Only then did he finally stop. He took most of his meals alone in his study. The room smelled faintly of leather, old books, and an old hunting dog that had died 5 years earlier. He saw his wife exactly once each week, Sunday evenings. They sat at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany dining table. Their conversations consisted entirely of facts. The weather, crop yields, the price of coal. It was less a marriage, and more a weekly report. Hazel did not mind. She spent her days quietly unraveling the slow decay that had settled over Stoneleigh Hall. She never attempted to play the Grand Duchess. When Mrs. Gable brought her the household menus for approval, a thick stack of grease-stained cards filled with elaborate roasts and extravagant meals, Hazel calmly handed them back. "The Duke eats mutton and potatoes," she said, standing in the cold stone kitchen. "I eat whatever is available. There are only 2 people living in this house, Mrs. Gable. Not a cavalry regiment. Sell the surplus food stores in the village. Use the money to buy lye soap and beeswax. This house smells like a crypt. I want every floor scrubbed until it shines." Mrs. Gable stiffened immediately. "The late Duchess," she replied carefully, "never concerned herself with scrubbing floors." "The late Duchess is dead," Hazel replied, her voice perfectly calm. "And I live here. Get the soap, Mrs. Gable." Hazel removed her heavy wool overskirts and tied a simple canvas apron around her waist. She never ordered the maids to do the work alone. Instead, she knelt beside them on the freezing marble floors. She scrubbed soot from neglected hearths. She sorted through the linen closets, rescuing what moths had not already destroyed. She uncovered the household ledgers in the steward's office. For 3 consecutive nights, she sat beneath the light of a single tallow candle, carefully tracing every pound that quietly disappeared from the estate. The numbers told a story. The village butcher had been charging Stoneleigh Hall nearly twice the proper market price. The coal merchant had been mixing worthless slate into expensive anthracite. Hazel corrected every problem. Not with shouting. Not with threats. But with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire life watching money disappear through carelessness. She rode into the village in an ordinary cart. She met each merchant face to face. Her voice remained polite. Her figures were exact. Her arguments impossible to dispute. Within 3 weeks, she had reduced the household expenses by 40%. Mr. Finch, the aging estate steward who seemed permanently damp with nervous perspiration, carried the revised account books into Tom's study on a miserable Tuesday afternoon in November. Tom sat behind his desk, rubbing tired fingers against his temples. He hated ledgers. He hated columns of figures. He hated endless accounting. The only thing he disliked more than numbers was the fact that, as a duke, he couldn't solve financial problems by punching someone. He looked down at the ledger Finch carefully placed before him. The handwriting in the margins caught his attention immediately. It wasn't Finch's frantic, untidy scrawl. The notes were small, precise, perfectly legible. "What is this?" Tom asked, tapping one of the corrected columns. "Her Grace, my lord," Finch stammered, wiping his brow with a wrinkled handkerchief. She audited the pantry accounts, the coal deliveries, and even the household soap. Tom frowned. He leaned closer. "She cut the butcher's bill in half." Finch gave an almost disbelieving shake of his head. "She informed the butcher that if he refused to lower his prices to the proper regional rate, she would purchase a herd of pigs and slaughter them herself in the courtyard." There was unmistakable admiration in the steward's voice. Tom stared at the neat, merciless columns of figures. Something unfamiliar tightened quietly inside his chest. Amusement. A feeling so long forgotten it almost felt rusty. That evening, after a long ride through freezing rain, Tom did not go directly to his study. Instead, he paused in the entrance hall. Something was different. The air no longer smelled of damp rot and neglect. Instead, it carried the clean scent of lemon oil, fresh wood smoke, and newly laundered linen. Tom slowly climbed the staircase toward the east wing. He had not walked this corridor since the day they first arrived. He stopped outside Hazel's room. A thin ribbon of warm yellow light spilled beneath the heavy oak door. He did not knock. He had no wish to intrude. Instead, he simply stood there, listening. The house was utterly silent. Then he realized something. For the first time in his life, silence no longer felt heavy. Felt anchored. The following afternoon, Hazel walked quietly into Tom's study. He sat behind his desk, surrounded by an untidy sea of maps, estate records, and unresolved boundary disputes. He looked up in surprise. Hazel wore a faded gray dress. Her sleeves were rolled neatly to her elbows. Her hands were red from cold water. A faint smudge of ink rested on her chin. She carried a polished silver tray. Upon it sat a single cup of tea, dark amber. No milk, no sugar. She made no announcement. She simply crossed the room, moved one of the northern boundary maps just enough to create a small empty space, and gently placed the cup upon the desk. The porcelain touched the wood with a quiet click. "You've been working for 6 hours?" Hazel said. Tom looked first at the tea, then at her. "There is a dispute over grazing rights along the western ridge. The tenants are threatening to burn each other's barns." Hazel lowered her eyes to the map. She neither apologized for looking, nor pretended she understood nothing. "The western ridge is mostly shale. The grass is poor. They are not fighting over grazing rights, Your Grace. They are fighting over access to the stream at the bottom of the slope." Tom paused. He bent over the map once more. His finger traced the narrow blue line winding through the valley. All morning, he had studied property lines, measurements, acreage. He had been thinking like a soldier defending territory. He had forgotten to think about the sheep. He looked back at Hazel. "How do you know that?" "Because sheep cannot drink rocks." Her answer was perfectly matter-of-fact. "Move the boundary 50 yards east. Give both farms access to the stream. The dispute will end." She turned, walked quietly toward the door. Her boots clicked softly against the wooden floorboards. Then she was gone. Tom remained staring at the map. Finally, he picked up his pen, dipped it into the inkwell, and carefully drew a new boundary, 50 yards farther east. Then he lifted the teacup. It was still warm. The tea was perfect. From that day forward, Hazel always brought him his tea herself. She never stayed long. Sometimes, neither of them spoke at all. She would quietly place the cup upon his desk, straighten a crooked stack of papers with one quick, efficient movement, then leave. At other times, Tom would ask a question about the household accounts. Hazel answered every one with calm, numerical precision. It became a peculiar sort of companionship. Practical, quiet, comfortable. Like two gears inside an old, broken machine, finally beginning to turn together. Winter arrived in Derbyshire without warning. It did not gently announce itself. It battered down the door. Late in January, a black, violent storm swept over the peaks. By noon, the sky had become the color of bruised iron. By 3 o'clock, the wind screamed around the stone towers of Stoneleigh Hall like a wounded animal. Snow fell so heavily that the stables, barely 50 yards from the house, completely disappeared into a white wall of drifting snow. Inside, the temperature dropped with alarming speed. The great stone walls that usually protected the house now trapped bitter cold instead. The heat from every fireplace disappeared straight up the chimneys. Tom sat inside his study wearing his heaviest riding coat despite being indoors. He attempted to read a letter from his solicitor. Outside, the wind rattled the leaded glass windows. Then, crack. A sharp, explosive report echoed through the house. It was immediately followed by the terrifying sound of shattering glass and the furious roar of freezing wind. Tom dropped the letter. He seized the heavy iron poker beside the fireplace and hurried into the corridor. The cold struck him like a physical blow. The noise came from the long gallery on the second floor, a vast vaulted room lined with towering Elizabethan windows. He climbed the staircase 2 steps at a time. His injured leg screamed in protest. Adrenaline silenced the pain. He burst into the gallery. One of the enormous 12-foot windows had exploded inward. The storm howled through the opening. Snow blasted sideways into the room. Within moments, the Persian rugs were disappearing beneath white drifts. Family portraits trembled violently against the walls. The pressure inside the gallery was immense, strong enough to threaten every remaining window. Tom swore under his breath. He needed canvas, heavy oak boards from the cellar, 3 strong footmen. But the servants' quarters were in the opposite wing, and the bell pulls had frozen solid. Shielding his face with one arm, he forced himself toward the shattered opening. He reached for the heavy velvet curtains. The wind ripped the fabric from his grasp, snapping it like a whip. "Leave the curtain," a voice shouted above the roar of the storm. Sebastian whipped his head around. Hazel was running down the gallery. She was dragging a massive, heavy canvas drop cloth, the kind painters used to cover furniture. A thick coil of hemp rope was slung over her shoulder, and a hammer was gripped tightly in her right hand. She wore no coat, only a heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair whipped wildly around her face in the raging wind. "Hazel, get out of here!" Sebastian roared, stumbling backward as another violent gust nearly knocked him off his feet. She ignored him. Instead, she hurled the heavy coil of rope toward his chest. He caught it by instinct. The brass fixtures on the wall. Hazel shouted, pointing toward the heavy sconces mounted between the windows. "Tie the corners there. The canvas is too thick to nail into the stone." Sebastian stared at her for the briefest moment. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't screaming. She was organizing their defense. He moved immediately. Grabbing the top corner of the heavy canvas, he fought against the storm. The freezing wind caught it like the sail of a ship, nearly tearing it from his grasp. His boots slipped across the snow-covered floorboards. Hazel threw her entire body weight against the lower edge of the canvas, forcing it toward the shattered window frame. "Pull, Sebastian." It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. The sound of it cut through the roar of the blizzard, sending a shock through his blood hotter than any fire. Sebastian planted his good leg firmly. He wrapped the thick rope around the brass sconce and pulled with every ounce of brutal strength he possessed. The canvas stretched tight across the opening. The wind shrieked furiously against it. Hazel dropped to her knees in the growing snow. Her fingers were already numb. Working frantically, she tied the lower corners to the iron radiator grates. Her knuckles scraped across the rough stone, leaving bright streaks of blood. She never stopped. Sebastian dropped beside her. Together they worked shoulder to shoulder inside the freezing vortex. He pressed his body against the canvas while Hazel pulled every knot as tight as possible. He could feel the desperate warmth of her body through her thin dress. "Done?" Hazel gasped, collapsing back onto her heels. The canvas snapped violently beneath the storm's pressure, but the ropes held. The blizzard was shut outside. The gallery fell into dim silence. Only the deep rumble of the storm remained beyond the makeshift barrier. They sat together on the snow-covered floor. Their chests rose and fell with exhausted breaths. Shattered glass glittered around them. Sebastian looked at Hazel. She was trembling violently. Her lips had turned blue. Blood slowly dripped from her raw knuckles, bright against her pale skin. Her hair had completely escaped its pins and clung to her rain-soaked cheeks. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful. He didn't stop to think. He didn't weigh the consequences. He simply reached for her. Sebastian pulled Hazel against his chest and wrapped his heavy, dry coat around her trembling body. She gasped at the sudden closeness. Her body stiffened for only a heartbeat, before her desperate need for warmth overcame her caution. She leaned into him, burying her face against the wool of his coat. "You little fool," Sebastian whispered, his rough voice barely audible above the storm. His chin rested gently against the top of her head. "You could have been pulled through that window." "You were losing your grip on the curtain," Hazel murmured softly. Her voice was muffled against his chest. Her freezing, bloodied hands clutched the fabric of his shirt. "You needed the canvas." Then, almost without realizing it, he spoke the words he had never intended to say. "I needed you to be safe." The words lingered in the icy air, heavier than the falling snow. Hazel slowly lifted her head. She searched his face with her pale hazel eyes. The cold, distant Duke had vanished. The man holding her now looked frightened, exhausted, and as though she had become the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. Slowly, he raised one rough hand. His thumb gently brushed a damp strand of hair away from her cheek. His touch was impossibly careful, as though she were made of fragile glass. "Your hands are bleeding," he said softly. Hazel looked at him, then gave the faintest smile. "They will heal." Sebastian didn't let her go. He stood, lifting her gently with him, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his injured thigh. One strong arm remained securely around her waist. "Come," he said quietly. "The kitchen hearth is the only fire that will survive this draft." They did not return to their separate wings. Instead, they walked downstairs together, leaning on one another. When they entered the kitchen, the servants were gathered in a frightened cluster near the ovens. The moment they saw the Duke, covered in snow, holding the Duchess close at his side, the entire room fell silent. Sebastian paid them no attention. He dragged a heavy wooden bench directly in front of the roaring hearth. Carefully he helped Hazel sit. A terrified scullery maid stood frozen nearby. Without a word, Sebastian took the clean towel from her trembling hands. Then he knelt before his wife. He gently took Hazel's injured hands into his own. He said nothing. Slowly, meticulously, he wiped away the blood and melting snow from her scraped knuckles. The warmth of the great fire gradually soaked into their wet clothes. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Snow buried the manor deeper with every passing hour. The world beyond Stoneleigh Hall disappeared completely. Hazel watched the top of Sebastian's dark head as he cleaned her wounds. She noticed the tightness in his broad shoulders slowly begin to fade. For a man who had wanted a ghost, he was holding her very tightly to the earth. The storm lasted for 3 long days. By the time it ended, Stoneleigh Hall lay buried beneath 4 feet of snow. The estate had become an island. The silence that followed was complete. Not the cold, oppressive silence of an empty house, but the soft, comforting stillness of a world wrapped in snow. Sebastian did not return to his study. The main house remained bitterly cold. So they settled into a small oak-paneled sitting room on the ground floor. A great fire burned in the hearth day and night. They shared the room. At first, it was an awkward, careful dance. Hazel sat in a wingback chair, quietly reading a leather-bound history of the county. Sebastian sat opposite on the sofa. He attempted to read a novel he had chosen at random from the library. In truth, he spent far more time watching Hazel over the top of the pages than reading the words before him. He noticed how she gently bit her lower lip whenever the text became difficult. He noticed how carefully she rested her bandaged hands in her lap. And every moment, he felt an irresistible pull to cross the 6 feet of carpet between them. On the evening of the 4th day, the wind finally fell silent. The clouds parted. Moonlight poured across the snow-covered moors, turning the landscape into a sea of silver. Hazel closed her book. She walked quietly to the window. Pulling back the heavy curtain, she gazed outside. "It looks clean," she said softly. Sebastian closed his book as well. He rose from the sofa, then crossed the room. He did not stop a polite distance away. He stopped directly behind her. So close. She could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. "It does," he agreed. His voice was low, almost lost in the quiet room. He looked not at the snow, but at her reflection in the dark window glass. "Hazel." She did not turn, but she leaned back, only the slightest fraction of an inch. A tiny, almost invisible surrender. "When I came to your father's house," Sebastian said slowly, carefully choosing every word, "I told him I wanted peace. I thought peace meant isolation. I thought it meant emptiness." Hazel remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the silver landscape beyond the glass. Slowly, Sebastian raised his hands. He hesitated for just a moment, then gently rested them upon her shoulders. His grip was warm, steady, grounding. He felt her draw a slow, deep breath, but she did not pull away. "Now," Sebastian whispered. His thumbs gently traced the line of her collarbone through the thick wool of her dress. "I've realized, an empty house is nothing more than a tomb. I didn't want a ghost, Hazel. I was simply too damaged to know how to ask for a partner. I was afraid of the noise. I was afraid of the demands. I believed any woman brought into this house would see only my limp, my scars, and my isolation." At last, Hazel turned. She now stood between Sebastian and the window. She wasn't trapped. She wasn't afraid. She simply looked up into his gray eyes. The hardened armor he had worn for so many years, the cynical shell that had protected him, had completely fallen away. For the first time, he looked utterly vulnerable. "Charlotte would have demanded London," Hazel said quietly. Her voice remained calm, steady, matter of fact. "Rosalind would have demanded brilliant conversation and London society." "And what do you demand?" Sebastian asked, searching her face. Hazel slowly raised her bandaged hands. She rested them gently against the lapels of his coat. Beneath the thick wool, she felt the slow, steady beat of his heart. "I demand you drink your tea before it goes cold," she said softly. A genuine laugh escaped Sebastian's chest. It was deep, rusty from years of disuse, unexpected in the stillness of the room. The tension that had lived so long in his jaw simply disappeared. For the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a practical solution to a dynastic problem, not as the quiet girl in the gray dress, but as the very center of his world. He slipped his arms around her waist, drawing her gently against him. The solid warmth of him surrounded her. "Is that all?" he murmured. He leaned closer. Only inches separated their faces. "I also demand," Hazel whispered, her breath catching, "that you stop working until 3 o'clock every morning. The ledgers will still be there at dawn. And I require you to let me repair the roof in the west wing." "Done," Sebastian said quietly. Then he kissed her. It was not a hesitant, nor polite kiss. It carried months of silent observation, unspoken longing, and the overwhelming realization that, without ever intending to, he had stumbled upon the greatest blessing of his life. Hazel kissed him back, with equal warmth, equal certainty. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him close. She tasted of strong tea and survival. He tasted of wood smoke and safety. Every cold calculation, every practical bargain, every transaction that had first brought them together, simply melted away, leaving behind only one undeniable truth. When they finally drew apart, both of them were breathing hard. Sebastian rested his forehead gently against hers. His arms remained securely around her waist. He closed his eyes. "Move your trunks," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Hazel blinked. "Move them where?" "Out of the east wing." Sebastian opened his eyes. There was no hesitation, no retreat. "The master suite is large enough for two. I am entirely finished living in a separate house from my wife." A slow warmth blossomed inside Hazel's chest. She smiled, a real smile, one that reached all the way to her pale hazel eyes. "Mrs. Gable will be scandalized," Hazel observed. "Mrs. Gable works for you," Sebastian replied. He pressed a gentle kiss against her temple. "She will adapt, or she will pack." They stood quietly beside the window, watching moonlight spill across the snow-covered moors. The enormous, drafty house around them remained perfectly silent. But the silence was different now. No longer the silence of loneliness or abandonment. It had become the quiet comfort of a shared life. The peaceful certainty of closing the door against the world, knowing the one person you wanted most was safely inside with you. When spring finally arrived in Derbyshire, it came with a violent thaw. Snow rushed into the streams. The rivers swelled into roaring torrents. The moors burst into bloom beneath a sea of purple heather. Highfield received its quarterly allowance. Every penny arrived precisely on time. Lord Richard Abernethy paid his gambling debts, and almost immediately acquired new ones. Charlotte eventually married a minor baron. He was 70 years old, and almost completely deaf. She settled into a London townhouse, where she hosted loud, desperate society parties. Rosalind wrote bitter poetry about the tragic isolation of women. She refused 3 respectable marriage proposals, because none of the gentlemen read enough Greek. Neither sister ever visited Stoneleigh Hall. They believed Hazel had become a tragic sacrifice, a quiet girl condemned to spend her life beside a monster in the cold northern wilderness. They could not have been more mistaken. Hazel stood upon the terrace, watching the first rays of sunlight spill across the distant hills. She wore a gown of rich emerald velvet, a striking contrast to the faded gray dresses of her former life. A steaming cup of dark tea rested comfortably in her hands. Behind her, the heavy glass doors opened. Sebastian stepped outside. His stride still carried a slight unevenness. One arm held a thick estate ledger. He looked tired, but the deep exhaustion that had once lived beneath his eyes was gone forever. He walked quietly behind her, wrapped one arm around her waist, and gently drew her back against his chest. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of her neck, breathing in the familiar scent of clean linen and rain-soaked earth. "The western boundary dispute is settled," he murmured, "and Finch says the new roof should be finished by August." Hazel leaned comfortably against him, resting her head upon his shoulder. She lifted her tea and took a slow sip. Strong, bitter, perfectly hot. "Good," she said quietly. "Then we'll have time to rebuild the glass house before winter." Sebastian chuckled. The low sound vibrated warmly against her back. He gently took the teacup from her hand, drank a sip himself, then handed it back. Together, they stood upon the terrace, 2 quiet souls, looking out across their untamed, beautiful world, completely content with the silence they had built together. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed Hazel and Sebastian's journey, tell us in the comments. Where are you listening from today? We'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from. If you enjoy slow burn historical romance, marriages of convenience, and peaceful storytelling designed to help you relax or fall asleep, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Until next time, sleep well, and we'll see you in the next journey through history.